Okay. So, um, we would we're really pleased to have Lee back here in the Lansing community after all these years. I have a memory of you, Lee, from when I was like 17 and just beginning to explore the scene. And I remember coffee shop readings where I heard you, and I remember bohemian parties with people like Ruelaine and Rosa Maria Arenas and Sam Mills. I think I remember having the good fortune to publish some of your poems in student or underground magazines, as we called them then, like Labyrinth, and Pros and Cons was one of them. Um, and after after those years in the late 70s, while I was out of the country, you were making a brilliant career here, a lifelong career as a poet. So I just want to say a few words about that. Um, Lee was born in St. John's, and she grew up on a 140-acre farm in the middle of Michigan and Lansing and other towns figure in her poetry, I know. She attended Lansing Community College and Michigan State, worked as a freelance writer for the State Journal when it was still thick and she was still an undergraduate, and published her first poem, I believe, in the Red Cedar Review. Yay. She went on to earn her MFA at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a PhD at State University of New York, Birmingham. And she has written, to my knowledge, 14 books so far. Short fiction, there's a book called Visitation Stories by the Yellow Shoe Fiction Series. Poetry collection delightfully called Bottle the Bottles, the Bottles, the Bottles. CSU Poetry Center. More Stories, The Tao of Humiliation, and then a book on the writing process, evocatively called Swallowing the Sea, on writing and ambition, boredom, purity and secrecy. Also an award-winning novella, The Guide to the Flying Island, 5 additional books of poetry, including Undid in the Land of Undone. I think we might be lucky enough to hear the title poem later. And 4 books of literary criticism. The 4th book of Lit Crit, Defensive Measures, is a study of how poets claim distinctive voices, a topic that interests us all, I know. And you can find more information on Lee and her work at Poets and Writers website, or her own website, www.leeupton.com. So much more that one could say, but maybe we'll stop for now and let the work speak for itself.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Cheryl. I'm wondering, can everyone hear me pretty well? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay. Well, first off, I really want to thank Ruelaine Stokes and Cheryl Caesars for organizing this. I'm really very, very grateful and very gratified, and thank you all for coming. One of the things that's been really surprising to me is that I was asked to read some poems from decades ago, and so I'm going to read a couple of those poems, and I also went back and looked at some of the early work that I actually have in chapbooks from years ago, and it was like seeing a stranger come before me, this woman from all those years ago. So in some ways, I want to thank Ruelaine and Cheryl for letting me see again that young woman whom I had forgotten. And thank you so much, both of you, for reminding me of that early part of my life and how supremely lucky I was to have the chance to meet such wonderful writers as you all, and to live in a house where there was so much joy with Rosa Renas and Sam Mills. And Sam, of course, we lost not long ago, a wonderful poet. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to read for you some early work and then move into some more recent work, and then talk a bit too. I think in so many ways I've been wildly lucky because, you know, one of the joys of my life, the persistent joy, has been writing, and beginning in Michigan with such, you know, clever, kind, generous people is something that has stamped my life. It's like a tattoo. I'll never get rid of the gratitude for Michigan. This first poem I'm going to read that Ruelaine I had mentioned about my reading is called International Eddies. And I don't know if any of you will remember that place at all. What I remember about being in my early 20s is never having any money, but International Eddies was reliably inexpensive. I love the name, and I know for some of the prompts, the idea about place is one that's going to be referred to. So I'll read you this early poem. It's probably my early 20s when I wrote it, a place poem. International Eddies, I couldn't even quite remember where it was, but Ruelaine said it was, maybe it still exists, on the northwest corner of Michigan Avenue and Fairview Street. International Eddies. The egg flour soup floats serene at International Eddies among the chilled naugahyde. The soda fountain swanning toward Eddie's $2.95 chum salmon. I drink soup and wait for the bluebird to peek under the floury egg. The waitress nudges me kindly as a sister, and I am in love with the man advertising shoes on his hat, the white woman with her artificial features, the brown bandage on an ankle I love. And there is no stopping tenderness toward the chef who claps tacos. I love the voices with their pleasure. Just for tonight, I could calculate marriage. I am so miserable, I understand everybody. Eddie seduces with a jeweled eye, winks and smiles, enough to be blessed, like he's not one of us, like he will live forever. The next poem I'm going to read was a lost poem, and Ruelaine found it. And in fact, in this wonderful act of kindness and generosity, she listened to an audio and then typed it up. But again, a really early poem. As Cheryl mentioned, my family lived on a farm about 30 miles north of Lansing, between Fowler and Maple Rapids. And my father, really knew something about cows. And one thing he knew about cows, and it's true, is that cows love music. So when I was a child, a very young child, he would bring me in the milk house and set me on this shelf so I could watch him milk the cows and listen to the radio, because music calms cows, and I think it calms children too. So this is called Milking. And again, from my early 20s, and a forgotten poem, Milking. Milking was when my father lifted me to the shelf with his radio, just in case those old bossies might turn against years of him. With my father's radio, I'd sit and watch the cool pumping machines, smelling the hay and straw and breathing. So early the bare light hurt. Then my father poured milk warmer than my hand in its mitten. I carried a pail to the calf who tried to pull me into her long, moony face with hunger. When I came back, my father, his hair already white, lifted me to the shelf again while the cows swung their heads and the radio talked of temperatures dipping every hour over Michigan. Out the milk house window above the shelf, I saw so much snow, stars whirled in my head. The radio clicked, and my father's hand brought me down so carefully, as if I could spill. Oh, I'll miss my father very much. I'm going to read now some poems that are really much more recent, so decades have passed, but some of the same, preoccupations are still there. Because Ruelaine had opened up my past to me, I went and looked at some early pieces I wrote, and there is a thread of concerns and obsessions that surely run through the work. This poem is called Hysteria. And, as we know, it used to be considered that women were victims of a condition where their wombs were wandering through their bodies. And that's what created hysteria or overexcitement. And I guess I still love overexcitement. So this is called Hysteria. My womb was floating and I was on it like the Jetsons. Hysterical laughter driving on a highway. Under the bridge hysteria. What is the womb doing now hysteria? And the blackbirds baked in the pie that they not only have to die, but entertain the king, poor things, like glass dipped in a barrel of oil, and the Vesuvius of each tiny headdress. And now I keep intruding on a conversation I'm having with myself. It's irresponsible to despair. And so I'm hysterical enough for now, although I didn't always know hysteria was tapping a knife all along the rim of my life. I confess I have so much practice in forgiving myself, even for hysterical gossip, breaking into a greenhouse at night, and I can't see what I trample, the stalks shattered, the pots of soil overturned, and yet the fragrance, hysteria inside the never opened book. Dear book, you with your stiff love, your breathless labors, you who never gave birth to a reader. I think one of the, thank you. I think one of the sad things in life is you go in a library sometimes and there will be a book and you open it and no one has ever taken the book out. You look at the old library cards, maybe now because everything's digitized, those records tell us nothing. But it's painful sometimes, when the book is almost seems glued shut and it hasn't been loved. Books need to be loved, certainly. I'm just going to read, I think, 3 more poems. This is a poem called Privacy, and it's a kind of exploratory poem that is, often my poems take quite a while to write because poems require that we surprise ourselves or outwit ourselves sometimes. But this poem came pretty quickly because I've thought a lot about privacy and how fortunate it is to ever be able to be private. So this is called Privacy. I like a private life, it's true. Sometimes it's so private, if I say something that's even a little bit arguably private, I feel disdain for myself. I remember how cruel people were to my mother when she was going blind, how even one of her doctors lied disdainfully, keeping part of her diagnosis private. Privacy is a kind of power. That must be obvious. Who cares? One of my friends said. I tell everyone everything about myself, she said. And that's when I knew she was the one who told my secret. I'm bearing to you my privacy, not by admitting all the shameful things I've done, especially those when I thought I was being moral, uncompromising, right. The one man I heard speak about the power of transparency caused so much suffering, I shudder when I hear his name. Right now, by talking about privacy, I'm giving up the secret of my great weakness, how much privacy means to me, although apparently it must not mean much, given that I'm not being private about it. A woman moved closer to us because she found my nephew attractive. I've substituted other nouns and pronouns for the correct ones in the above statement. Today, I'm wearing a big confidential sign around my neck. I've lived enough, long enough, to know enough to keep my mouth shut. I wrote down those words years ago so that I would forget them. In the gallery, the man said, I look at that painting of a barn and I can just about smell the hay and those strawberries and the lemons, the rind on that lemon strip, the curl of it. I see that and I can just about smell the gin. I'm thinking about light at dusk, last light that brings on thoughts I battle with. If I were more romantic, I'd say demons, except they're bodiless. The spread of sunshine inside that onion or the turrets inside the lemon do not dim, although hidden. I put on a rind myself. A still life is not still, it is bearing itself. And I'm going to read a poem. Thank you. I'm going to read a poem called Love's Ode. It's a kind of chain poem, and where one word leads to the next, but in some ways, so many poems are chain poems where one word leads to the next, and you know, with the process of association. Well, for me, in any way, at any rate, leads the poem onward. This is called Love's Ode. There once was a man who loved me with a cat's love, which is to say I could not depend on it, although I could depend on his punctuality. A cat's appetite is a clock. There once was a man who loved me like a man, not like any man, but like one particular man. A clock has time on its hands, and you can tell time's up by its face. There once was a face that loved me like a suitcase on the conveyor belt, forgotten for 2 weeks at the airport. There once was a man who loved me like an airport. I had to take off my clothes just to get past security. There once was security in loving no one at all. No one at all was enough for me. Then I bought a cat. A man appeared who loved me as if he loved me. Love was a cat in a clock, in a suitcase, passing through airport security. I risked so much, it was beyond me. And the final poem I'll read is The Best Drink. I don't know about you, but I haven't been to a bar for ages, you know, and that was even kind of before the pandemic. It's been a long time. You know, thinking about, you know, if you could imagine a kind of elixir, it doesn't have to be alcoholic, but some kind of elixir, what would be the best drink if you could create that drink for yourself? You know, I think so much of the imagination, we have it because it's about what we don't have. So this is called The Best Drink. The afternotes, orange, a little frangipani, and then something harsh and mineral, an old jug rutted out of the ruins of a lost chapel. But first it was like drinking spring water, lathed by rocks, fatty with quartz. No, it's inexplicable, even the way that drink spared our feelings. That drink liked loneliness and appreciation, lingering appreciation. Just thinking about that drink creates a kind of yearning that douses you like sea spray. I drank that drink and was convinced my body was flying of its own accord, and why not? The myth of Icarus is an ugly story retold and retold and retold by someone resentful who wasn't able to drink the best of the drinks we ever drank. There was a clear sky in that glass and shaggy pines and a bit of snow melt doused in a fire. And soon a blue shawl drew itself from the rim and brimmed over us both. And something caught inside our throats and released some old grief. a grief possibly that didn't even come from us or even from our ancestors. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so very, very, very much. We're moving on to our question and answer session, and I wanted to start with the first question. Lee, I remember taking a workshop from you 43 years ago in the old East Lansing Marble Schoolhouse. And one of the things you said in that workshop that I adored was you said that we would learn to be able to use criticism, both the positive and the highly negative, to our advantage. And I thought, wow, that would be such a great power to have. And in your book on writing, there's a chapter called You Flirt with Failure, but You Marry Ambition. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about failure and the ways that writers can use their failure to advantage.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for being in that workshop. That was such fun. Everyone was so open and good to one another. I remember that.
It was beautiful. It was really beautiful.
That was great. Well, okay. About failure, I know something about failure. I'll tell you, but I will say that I think that writing poems, sometimes the impulse comes and you get a poem and it arrives and in the form that pleases you. But I think so much of the time you are flirting with failure because you're trying to surprise yourself. I always think of, Robert Frost, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. So you're outwitting yourself in a sense. So, as with any worthwhile endeavor, it's possible to make so many mistakes or to take the wrong route. So I think the sense of flirting with failure is partly what you're doing when you're writing. You're trying to create something exciting and new for yourself and that you hope will mean something to other people. At the same time, it won't necessarily mean that to, other people. So there's always the sense of you're flirting with failure, but you're married ambition, because ambition, not in the worldly sense, I'm talking about ambition in the sense of ambition for the poem, means you're hopeful for it. You want the thrill of language to, sustain you. You want that persistent entry into what language makes possible. Failure, I must say, I think failure, it's really, really interesting to think about because all writers fail often. If you think in terms of rejection, most writers have been rejected a great deal. And I always think of the Stephen King story of how his wife pulled out of the wastepaper basket, the copy of Carrie. He was ready to give up, but he didn't give up. Most writers, you fail in one way or another. You fail within the poem, or you fail toward others. I remember once giving a reading and a man squealed like a pig during it. But the one thing about failure that I think is really interesting is you can make something of it. One of the worst responses I ever got to my work, it struck me as, really painful. I made something of it. I wrote a short story called, You've Made It When They Hate You. And in it, a critic, it's not clear, but he may die in the end of the piece. And so it was a kind of way to deal with what seemed very cruel to me. So there's a sense of even really hostile criticism, sometimes imaginatively, can suggest something about the work, about one's life. At the same time, I want to be realistic. I don't know a writer who's not in some ways very sensitive, even those with, a hard exterior sometimes. So it's difficult to project oneself. I think what is most important, at least for me, has been, finding, again, going back and again, reading others' poems, reading others' fiction, reminding oneself of the spark, the kind of risk, how language gives us an entry into this inner world we wouldn't be able to access otherwise. I'll close up this answer very soon, but there's so much to think about. I think when it comes to failure for each writer, that, I heard recently someone say you only fail if you stop writing. I think there's some truth to that. But there's also the problem, it may be that you never fail, because even if you stop, it may be that there's another medium that will give you the same access. As for poetry, I think sometimes the greatest successes come when you think about what in the work pleases you. Sometimes I used to tell my students that it can be helpful to think about when you were a child. My cat wants to get in here. She's just driving me nuts here. I love her, but she's driving me nuts. Anyway, I tell my students, remember playing hide and seek when you were a kid? And did you ever play hide and seek and no one came to find you? That was, my story sometimes. And then you're there for a long time and this little voice emerges in you. And that kind of quiet voice, it can be one of the voices of poetry. It's not the only one. There's a very performative, glamorous, outward moving voice, but there can also be a very kind of quiet, soothing voice that poetry gives us access to. And in that world, there's no such thing as failure.
I don't know if I'm speaking for everyone here, but I would dearly like to know what you did when someone squealed like a pig at you.
Yeah, it was, I've even written about it. So I sort of tried to take everything that's a little bit painful. At first, I thought I didn't realize, I thought it was machinery malfunctioning. And I felt, the people in the audience being very uncomfortable. And I thought, oh, I'm in a position of responsibility. What if the building blows? But I was reading with another poet who handled it really, really beautifully, because that poet got heckled too. It was the poet Philip Levine, and he was heckled and just took the person to task. But I imagine, when I think about it, I can't be entirely angry, partly because I had written one poem about a pig, so it could have been kind of participation.
Sound effects, yeah. I see that Mary Fox has commiserated with you in the chat. She's written, the pain of handling rejection or hostility in your voice is real. Since I write about misogyny a lot, angry male voices find me. So.
Yeah, I remember reading at the Robin Theater and being heckled by one male voice there, and I just kept going. And eventually the audience turned on him. Mm-hmm. And that was very satisfying. And then I got applause for being heckled, which was kind of funny.
I'm going to take the next question, if I may, because you brought up Stephen King, so thereby I don't have to be embarrassed at bringing him up either. I remember something he said about writing and teaching at the same time, and I'd neglected to mention that Lee has recently retired from a position as professor of English and writer in residence at Lafayette College in Eastern Pennsylvania. So like so many of us, you spent years trying to write and teach either at the same time or alternately. Stephen King said that writing and teaching at the same time is like trying to drive your car while you're giving someone else a jump start to their battery. And I wondered if you saw it the same way, or if you find that those two practices can in fact nourish each other.
I think it's so individual. There are some writers I know who really find that teaching really does interfere with their ability to write and to choose other professions. In my own case, I think it's a great privilege to be able to teach. And I had, all those years had, so remarkable students. The poet Ross Gay was one of my students, Yolanda Wisher, Anthony Kaleshoe. And I could think in so many ways teaching changed for me at a certain point when I really let loose the reins on teaching and thought of it more as a conversation and tried to stay out of the light for my students. It changed for me too a lot when I started having students perform their work aloud in class. And no matter the kind of class I taught, I would always have students present their work, and then we would always applaud afterwards because it takes such courage, particularly for emerging writers or writers who haven't been working for a while, to present their work to us. I also taught humor writing, which was such a joy to teach. I love teaching that. It has a lot in common with teaching poetry because it's about disrupting expectations. And so I found a lot of joy in it, a lot of energy. I remember the first time, teaching a class, leaving and feeling that kind of hopped up energy as if I'd had 12 cups of coffee. And I realized the students gave me that. And it is a way to bring into your life new language, new perspectives. And I always felt a great deal of care for my students. I still am in contact with some of my students, of course, and with some of my colleagues, even though I stepped away from teaching, so that I can write full time. But I have nothing but gratitude for it. And at the same time, I respect writers who say for their personality, that doesn't work. It does take an immense amount of energy. The part of academia that was difficult for me wasn't the teaching, it was all the committee work, and the reports and the things that have nothing to do with teaching. I think that can be very draining.
Let me just remind participants, if you have a question for Lee, go ahead and write it in the chat. And Lee, I have a question. Could you tell us about a writing practice or a strategy that has worked really well for you?
Oh, certainly. I think one thing that's been helpful to me, and I don't know how it works for others, but I try to really not force whatever I'm working. I mean, I might have an originating idea, but I try to kind of let my mind wander and see what happens. I think there's a lot of trust in writing, and with time, growing to trust one's own mind, that you can take a lot of roads not taken. And there's always the revision practice, but sometimes what seems silly or inconsequential, on first reading can sometimes, offer up depths. So I think that's been useful to kind of, be very light in terms of thinking about what the poem can do and not forcing the poem the way you wouldn't force a child, for instance. Because a new poem is a kind of tender thing, as is, I feel the same way about fiction, and just trust that something will emerge. Something else I sometimes do, which actually seems rather mechanical, is sometimes with poems that don't quite work or don't seem satisfying, I'll array them out and I'll do a few things. Sometimes I'll combine them. I'll say, okay, what's going on here? How can I have a kind of catalyst, or, how can I have a kind of new sparks and new shadows by bringing two poems that don't quite work together? I've done that with fiction too. And it sounds mechanical, but suddenly you realize that maybe you've been hiding something from yourself. Maybe there's something more to say. Another technique I've used too is to sometimes within a poem to go deeper, I'll just insert a line like, I don't believe you, okay? And then see what happens, see what emerges then, or just to kind of turn the poem upside down, to start it from the end and move forward. And everything I've done that was really fun to do. And it's a weird thing to do, but I love the weird, because I think poetry comes out of flaws and imperfections and what looks wrong. You know, I think, excuse me, Wallace Stevens says he loves words that sound wrong. But sometimes I'll give myself a weird little task. I have a short story that I'm really fond of, and that surprised me. But before writing it, I gave myself a task, and I said, this poem is going to end with, not poem, this short story is going to end with these words: there were squirrels. And how do I get there? How can I possibly get there? And I mean, it seems like, I mean, it's like a little trick. I also love deadlines. I love anthologies who have calls for writing. I love writing prompts too, because sometimes you need to think about what possibilities could there be moving forward. I also believe in looking at what in life we're told continually how to feel, but often we don't feel that way. And I think that is the source of a lot of writing, the kind of friction between how we're supposed to feel and how we actually feel. So that sort of mixed feeling is sometimes, I think, a really rich area, you know, to move toward that as a strategy. What's really bothering me, and to play around with that a bit.
These are wonderful suggestions. Thank you so much. Mary has a question going back to your teaching, and that she says, I think that some teachers have a hard time not imprinting themselves on young poets. How do you keep from teaching students to be you as a poet and teach them to find their authentic voices?
Well, that has been very, I've never known a student who wanted to be me. So it's pretty easy. But I think I know exactly what's being referred to. I sometimes will judge a writing contest, and the contestants sound like the teacher. I think, uh-oh, what have we got here? So I think what can help with that is, having the reading being really wide, and, introducing students to lots of anthologies, not only the writers one admires, but other writers. Sometimes I would have students, have these twin influences, one writer whom they feel a great deal of, affiliation with, and then another writer whose work they don't like. And I, ask them to really look at these writers and try some imitations. I really believe too, when I was teaching and having students experiment with imitations, because try as you might, you can't really sound exactly like another person. Your own personality, the threads of your personality will, move into the capillaries of whatever you create. So sometimes that helps, but I do know, respectfully, that's a real danger. And it may be just part of apprenticeship. It may be sometimes that students need to sound like a particular teacher with a very strong personality, en route to finding a way to honor their own background, the way their own people speak. When we talked about strategies before, I think I want to mention a couple of things. One is that I think, writing is listening, and listening to what other people say, and capturing in some ways the people who took care of you when you were a child, their particular way of speaking. That was my entry into some ways to writing my own poetry, was really listening to my family. I had a wonderful family, and listening to how they spoke, because every family has its own particular way of speaking. The other thing I'll say, and it's about students, this is something I came across quite a lot with students, is students who are so funny and vivid in their speech, but when it came to writing, that all drained away. And so I think sometimes it was helpful to talk to students about how they need to honor their own speaking voices and honor their own humor. I mean, what is humor but, a way to readjust the frame of our world and to see things anew. But sometimes it comes to people easily. And I think people think some people think if things come easily, they're not worthwhile. But in writing, if it comes easily to you, some parts of it, maybe, writing's hard enough. Why not use your humor or use whatever particular strength you have and just say, these are these little gifts I've been given. And, I'm gonna honor them and not disrespect myself, not disrespect my humor. But I have come across it again and again, students who don't allow humor to enter their work, when that is just a wonderful part of their personality that they can enjoy, and that probably all of us need it, particularly during these difficult times.
Lee, if you were going to offer some advice to your young writing self, what advice would you give that 20-year-old woman?
Well, I would not be so bold as to advise her about anything. I would be like, because I would mess up her life. What I would do though, if I could go back in time, I would take her and all her friends out to dinner, because we had no money. And I'd also really tip the waiter or waitress or who's ever helping us really well, because when I think about it, we had so little money, all of us. And when we did go out to dinner, you're still kind of gathering your pennies. God knows how much we gave the waiter or waitresses. So I guess my sense is that, poetry comes out of flaws and misgivings. And that young woman I used to be, I just would not patronize her. I know if I said, don't do this or do this, she would just avoid me forever. So I think I just tell her one thing I would tell her this, and I would tell her to celebrate more, anytime a poem that she felt gave her something, to celebrate and to take time more slowly, not to rush things so much.
What would she say, Lee? If your 20-year-old self were here today, what would she say to you and to us?
Well, what would she say? Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think she'd be so surprised. She wouldn't be surprised that I've got a cat beside me. She wouldn't be surprised about that. She'd be delighted. But I think she'd just be so gratified and shocked that I'd be here. I remember when I was one of those at the community college, there was a class where we had to write our own obituary, and I had myself dying at 19 and everything. So I think, every year is just, I'm just so grateful and grateful to my family, and, I'm grateful to poetry, and I'm grateful to fiction, and grateful to you all for being here. So I think that young woman would just, she never knew she would be so fortunate.
You mentioned twin influences, good influences and bad influences. I wonder if one example of each from your life might kind of emerge, just writers, poets or fiction writers, or any kind of writer who impressed you on both sides of the equation as wonderful models to follow, or the absolute opposite. No, that's not how I want to be a writer.
Yeah, I guess there's so many writers whose work I admire, and it's funny because I write fiction also, and I have so many short stories where Yeats appears or Keats appears, or not necessarily in person, but in references. So they haunt my imagination at some level. Dickinson, what would we do without Emily Dickinson? With contemporary writers, so many I admire so deeply, like Terence Hayes, Vivi Francis. I think it's just brilliant. I've taught her work. Diane Seuss, Michigan poet, I think is just out of this world. Just writing that's just so memorable and vivid and daring, and you just don't know what's going to happen line to line within her work. Oh gosh, with the fiction writers, I'm really, really fond of Muriel Spark. She has a great novel, Loitering with Intent, about a woman, you know, writing her first novel. There's so much joy and wonder in that. Iris Murdoch, The Sea, that novel has been really important to me. I don't have writers that I dislike personally. I mean, maybe I don't know enough writers, but there are writers whose work I really admire, but could not do. I mean, I read a lot of Robin Robertson's work. He's a Scottish poet, and I admire his work, but I don't think I could have kind of. It's very different in some ways in the kind of compression within the work. A writer like Stevie Smith, you know, with a, you know, such, you know, she's still so neglected when she was, you know, really important to someone like Sylvia Plath. And I think even possibly even John Ashbery. You know, that work I can't quite do, although I have played around in some ways with her voice.
I'm going to read another comment and maybe make a question out of it from Mary Fox, but I want to invite the rest of you, please throw your questions in the chat as well. I see a lot of people here would have really interesting things to say. Mary Fox has reminded us that we should again thank Lee for her service as a judge for the Mark Ritzenhein Awards. We're very appreciative of that. And she's also noted your merging of and your drawing on both stage and page writers. And maybe there's a question in there. Do you find certain kinds of writing seem to be born to be performed and others to be read silently? Do you see distinct characteristics? Do you get drawn them in different ways?
This is such wonderful questions. Oh, and by the way, it was a joy to judge the contest. So many good entries, and each was so distinctive. The voices, you know, were very distinctive. So many congratulations to all who entered. You know, in thinking about, you know, how, you know, to, you know, I saw a question about finishing, and I'll maybe tag that on a bit. I think that it's sometimes difficult to know when poems are finished. You know, I think one of the answers I've heard from another writer is that they have to change us somehow, that, you know, a poem is finished when you feel somehow changed. You know, there's the sense that poems are never finished. I actually don't believe that. I think that some poems, they followed their route. They are indeed finished. They have a life that, you know, comes to a kind of closure. And I think you can fiddle with a poem for such a long time that it can lose its initial juice, in a sense. So I do have the feeling that something is finished when I just can't go back toward it anymore and into it. I also think that poems can almost be like pinball machines. You know how in a pinball machine, you know, the ball will hit at various points. It's done sometimes when you look and you can see that all the images or the complex of idea and image come together, and they seem to hit every other part of the poem. And then you think, this is it. I mean, poems, they have to have a kind of certain incompleteness, or the reader can't enter into them. Cheryl, I'm not sure I answered your poem because your question, because I was thinking so much about the poetry contest that I kind of lost the thread. Did you want to ask me again the question?
Maybe there's a question about stage and page poetry.
Stage and page, that's right.
I do remember when I first heard you read, I was fascinated by how totally you were immersed, how you got inside the poem, and the poem became a presence in the room. It wasn't that you were just reading words that were on the page and you were repeating them, but the mind and the experience in the poem was just coming to life. And so I've always seen you as a, you know, an oral poet, you know, something like that, but you're also a page poet, a literary poet, and you work in both traditions. So just say something.
You know, what happened, I was so embarrassed because all I could think about, I was going through the poems that were in the contest, and then suddenly the stage page I lost, and then I saw in the chat about finishing, and I thought, oh, well, I'm finished in some ways answering this. But I will say this about what I thought of initially as Cheryl was speaking was about something I'd heard at a I think it's Associated Writing Programs conference, where on the stage, it was never recorded. I don't believe it was allowed to be recorded, but there was Seamus Heaney and Derek Walcott, and they were asked where poems come from. And Walcott said he felt that they come from silence. And Heaney said he felt they come from clamor. And I think they were kind of playing with our minds, because I could imagine that they both felt poetry can come from both of those places. And I also thought, you know, one could have said it or the other could have said it. That is, Heaney could have said that poets come from silence and Walcott from clamor. And I think that relates to kind of stage versus page. There are some poems that have their life in their kind of performative energy. They're very outward. And then there are other poems that are very inward. And I find it's a very different experience reading a poem on a page as opposed to hearing a poem. Reading a poem on a page, and I go at my own rate. And, you know, I tend to go much slower than a performative poet would. Same time, there are poems that they have to be read very quickly. Sometimes very political poems too, they need to be charged with, you know, they almost need to annihilate us in some ways to break the kind of crust of convention. And so, you know, you see how the voice is working performatively. But I think that we need both, right? We need poems that are very performative, and then those poems that are somehow very quiet and mysterious, and that feed us in another way. So I guess I would want, what I love most are poems that work in both registers. Like they can work being read, but they also can be like this very one-on-one, singular, quiet gift to the reader, where they're intimate, and you feel that, oh, this poem is speaking to me, and the poet disappears. It's about the reader, and the reader is somehow working with the language, and the reader is really making the poem.
Joyce Meyer has observed that maybe it's a kind of ricochet, to use your prior metaphor, between silence and clamor, referring to the reading that you spoke about. And she said, I was thinking about another tension between sound and image that could characterize maybe spoken and page poems. And now the questions are coming thick and fast. Rosalie has asked, when you're judging the contest, what makes a poem or a series of poems stand out above the others?
Okay, well, you know, the poems that I got from the Lansing Poetry Club were so wonderful because there wasn't a cliche in them. I mean, sometimes I judge a contest and it's easy because, you know, you set the cliches aside. You know, it's not that you can't use cliches in poetry, but if you use them, you know, we have to make them new. We have to twist the language in some ways so that we can see words again and, you know, weigh them, and so that they have a texture. But I think, you know, I'm looking sometimes to see what I haven't seen before. And I think too that with a lot of poems, is there a sense of a personality? Is there a sense of urgency in the poem? When I judge a contest too, sometimes, I read them multiple times and I see what lingers, what are there certain portions of it that haunt the memory. And it becomes very difficult when so many poems are so very good. But I think, and it's very subjective too. I mean, I've lived with enough rejection in my life to know that, it's a lovely thing to be accepted, but it's also, one can't count on that. But I think it's about the memorability of the poem too. Poems are like these spikes in the brain, and like, which ones, stick. What's the stickiness of this particular poem? And it's often has to do with some new tension in the language, some new conjunction of meaning, some sense too of a living personality that's inhabiting the poem in a way that seems urgent, that won't let us forget it.
Ida from Greece asks, how can one develop one's writing voice? How do we pay attention to our voice so we can understand it better?
Okay, I think I've sometimes worked with multiple voices, and so I think in my own work there's a sense that there's multiple voices at work, and I think how to find those particular voices, which are different which is a different task for each of us, probably starts with kind of listening to the people who are in your family. So listen to them, jotting down things that they say, listening to people on the street, even. We have people who yell outside a lot, frankly, and it's so sad, but just listening to what they say, and then you kind of catch the rhythm of it. And I think kind of, something I do too that maybe goes with strategies is I do what a lot of us do, free writing, just to kind of see what's in my own mind, and can I harvest anything? And then going through and circling the parts that seem to be unexpected, and then putting them on another sheet of paper and seeing what's there. So I think it's a two-way process. It's listening to others, but listening to oneself. I think it's reading a lot and finding particular voices that strike you and that make you feel like writing. And I don't think one has to be dutiful either. If I read something that makes me feel like writing, I don't even stop to finish it. I just start writing. I think thank you. You have given me this energy, and now I'm going to see what can happen with this rhythm, because we can always go back to that work of writing later, but we might not always capture that first voice. I think too, reading, doing what the Lansing Poetry Club does, giving people opportunity to read their work in front of others, you start hearing your own voice. Probably many people have had the experience, I certainly have, when you're reading and you realize, oh, this line does not work, and you'd worked on the poem for a long time, but until you brought it before others in that act, you may not really have heard it yet. So I think those are kind of ways, through testing, through experimentation, you get a sense of different voices. Because I work in fiction, I love writing dialogue, and that's where you get these different voices at work. And you see too that, it might have been Cecil Miwash who said that human beings are like apartment buildings. There are many of us within each of us. So there are many, many voices, and you start figuring out, ways to just, have access to those voices by writing. I think, and writing in all moods, all times of day, just see what happens. It's such an inexpensive technology, as opposed to, say, making a film. You got a piece of paper or your laptop, and, just trust yourself that, there are things there that are waiting to be brought forward. So I think, patience, but also, giving yourself an opportunity with what time you have.
Let me read a question by Loring Werble. He says, a friend often says she is, quote, drawing an Ashbury curtain around this part of the poem. Do you see a danger in drawing a deliberate boundary of obscurity, or is this an okay tactic?
Oh, hello, Lori. Well, I must say, I mean, that's a tough one because I write some poems. I mean, I've had some people say, I don't understand your poems at all. And, but they, you know, okay, I'll mention this. Like, I love Edward Lear and kind of nonsense verse and Stevie Smith. And I think of poetry as an experience. And I think sometimes we ask of poetry what it doesn't want to give us. Your poetry wants to give us an experience. And we all grew up, or most of us anyway, with nonsense verses that might have had meaning at one time, but they keep pleasing us. You know, Jack and Jill went up the hill. I don't know those people, you know, but they please me. The sounds please me. So I tend to think that you know, poems live within us according to what we do with them. And if you're creating an experience, what may seem obscure to one isn't obscure to another. You know, what we wrote 20 years ago may need to be footnoted heavily now. So, you know, you have to just listen, you know, work with your own ear, you know, what works. So, and I think of someone like Ashbery. I mean, there's some beautiful, beautiful, beautiful poems that he's written. There's one where there's a violin inside an iceberg, and I've never forgotten that image. And so there is that sense too that he's playing with planks of language to see what the musical quality emerges. I think too, it's a part of, you know, what does our ear need to hear? You know, the same way with music, how we like all different kinds of music. There's some poetry out there for each of us, and then there's some poetry that just will not please us. I remember once, and this is more about writing, you know, with my daughters watching a documentary about J.K. Rowling. And she said, if someone has to love it, what you write, someone has to hate it. And that, I remember listening to that and thinking, that's actually really useful for a writer. So sometimes I think what seems obscure to one of us may seem to another person this visceral experience of language, which opens up, you know, what is poetic within us, what is otherwise seemingly inaccessible, because it resists words, it resists accessibility. And so much of what poetry does is it resists agreed upon categories. It tells us that what we don't have words for is of ultimate meaning to us. So thank you.
John Kay and his iPad would like to know whether you've encountered a distinct division or separation between your poetic and your fictional voices.
Well, gosh, I love writing poetry. Poetry is the first love, but even when I was starting to write poetry, I was writing fiction on the side. But I always like what Muriel Sparks said. You know, she's known as a fiction writer. She only had, like, I think she had one book of poetry, but she said that, and she was, you know, very prolific as a fiction writer. She said everything she wrote was poetry. So she, you know, refuse the distinction between genres in that sense. But it is different. You know, I will say that it's not the same. I've always thought of it almost as if poetry, in my experience of it, is more vertical. There's like a vertical deep dive, whereas fiction is more horizontal. The kind of fiction I want to write has cause and effect. Fiction doesn't have to have that. But I like working with kind of the development of a character. Even if the fiction is very fable-like or experimental, there's a sense that there's revelation to be had. And so it took me a really long time to learn how to write longer fiction. It took me, you know, I practically had to outline how novels and short stories work, those that I loved. But how I moved though, and, you know, was I worked first through the voice. My first fiction pieces were almost like extended poems because they tend to be more like monologues with a voice. And even now, the voices tend to be very rhythmic in the fiction too. So there's a lot in common in terms of compression, rhythmic, trying to find a voice and allowing multiple voices to speak. So there's a difference, certainly, and poetry came readily to me. Fiction, I had to keep teaching and reteaching myself, and buying books about how to write fiction, because when I did fiction, it gave me real happiness and worked really well. I mean, my ideal day would be in the, as if I would have all this time, but in the morning to write poetry. And then when that's exhausted, because poetry just wrings you out, at a certain point, gives you all this joy, but at a certain point you wrung out. And then I'd write fiction, because fiction, the tension is lighter, Also, I've never outlined a poem in my life, but large fiction pieces, at certain point, I start outlining just to see what's there. So there are deep distinctions, and yet at the same time, notes of connection as well.
Lori Hollinger wants to know where International Eddie's was. And so maybe I can answer. It's on Michigan Avenue, right on the northwest corner of Michigan Avenue. It's where La Mai Tai was for a long time. But back in the late 70s, it was called Eddie's. Yeah, Eddie's Chinese restaurant. You know it.
The corner of Michigan and where?
Isn't it
Fairview.
Fairview?
Fairview.
Fairview.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Marcy says next to Raups, R-A-U-P-P, just down from Everybody Reads now. Well, that's a landmark. We all know where that is. Is it still there then?
It's turned into a Chinese restaurant again.
It's turned back into a Chinese restaurant again.
But it's not Eddie.
But I think it's
It's
still,
not Eddie.
it's not Eddie, but it's still,
It's Chinese. Yeah.
it's Chinese. Is it still open?
I don't know with the pandemic.
Right,
No.
it's been a hard
Harry
time.
says it was also known as Fast Eddie's, presumably because it wasn't fast. Oh, Mariana and Bob also used to call it Fast Eddie's. It took 2 or more hours to receive a takeout order.
And
Wow.
chicken.
So Cheryl, how are we doing for time?
It's 4:12. Should we share some prompts?
Why don't we do that? That would be great. And you're in charge of this
I'm the
section.
screen sharer,
Okay, great.
like the secret share. Can you guys see my screen? So does everybody see Love's Ode? Okay, so we heard that one earlier. And this for us was a good example of surprising, striking metaphors, sort of like the violin and the iceberg that you mentioned a moment ago in Ashbery's poetry. So if you feel inspired, we will invite you to write a poem or a prose sketch in which you play with metaphors and allow them to be surprising and perhaps even nonsensical, and see where they take you. And if the chain ends up reconnecting at the end, as it did for Lee, and the snake bites its tail, that's okay too. Anything more we wanted to say about that one, Ruelaine?
Just one of the things I've always marveled at are Lee's metaphors, because they just make my brain take these big leaps. And I thought this poem certainly does that, but you can also see the same thing, I think, in many of her poems.
Then the next prompt that we had was inspired by the poem Privacy. Listening to you, Lee, I was reminded how I used to sit in church and hear a beautiful Kyrie and think, that doesn't sound sorry, it sounds proud, you know? And then thinking it over, why shouldn't you try to say you're sorry as beautifully as possible? Why not make your apology into a beautiful gift? So the question here is not asking you to reveal a secret, but to think about, if you decided to write about it, how would you do it? Would you compose a beautiful Kyrie? Would you put on a rind of self-protection? What would your still life look like bearing itself? Other remarks on that one, Ruelaine?
No, but I really love the way it, sort of dances around and through the different feelings
Yeah.
she has about privacy. I love the multiplicity of views.
Yeah. This one I thought would be really good for this group, an etymology poem. And that's really, hysteria takes apart, unpacks this word, where it came from, what it's meant over the years. So we wanted to invite you to take a word that's always intrigued you, or perhaps pleased you by its sound or its appearance, and do a thorough etymological search. OED is now mainly online, or some other etymological dictionary, and unearth the buried metaphors in that word and rearrange and play with those metaphors, free write about one of them, follow the associations as Lee did with hysteria, wandering womb. Then the best drink, with its wonderful taste images, taste impressions. We were sort of wondering why most poetic images tend to be visual or sometimes auditory. Is that because of the distance that you can take from the object that allows you to write about it, or a larger vocabulary for sight and sound? Imagine a poem with no visual or auditory imagery, only smell and or taste and or touch. Or speak for the food or drink, as Lee did for the best drink. Speak with the voice of a food or drink that you know well. What would absinthe say if it could speak? More remarks on that? Then option 5 for a place poem, we got to hear both International Eddies and Milking, both very evocative of place. So as the weather warms up and the sun is out, go to a favorite place where you feel comfortable and safe, and you can observe in your neighborhood, in a park, maybe outside a restaurant, ice cream store. Observe, feel, take your time, write field notes, write some kind of notes, use precise details. What do you learn from your senses? What forces or feelings are at work? What's the emotional landscape of the place you're in? Now, and there's milking, and you'll be getting all of these. Did we decide to stop with 5 prompts, or did we want to inundate them with more?
mean right now?
Yeah,
How are we doing for time? We're
4:20. Do we want
4:20.
to stop there and have our closing poem? Or
Well, why don't we give Lee the opportunity to read 1 or 2 or 50 more poems?
that sounds great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to close off, I'll read one poem from the book before the bottles, the book. It's the title poem from the book called Undid in the Land of Undone. And I'll end with this, and also just immense thanks. This has been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I wish everyone many poems that give life meaning, happiness, and enlarge your life. This is called Undid in the Land of Undone. All the things I wanted to do and didn't took so long. It was years of not doing. You can make an allusion here to Penelope if you want. See her up in that high room undoing her art. But enough about what she didn't do. Not doing was what she did, plucking out the thread of intimacy in the frame. So let's make a toast to the long art of lingering. We say the cake is done, but what exactly did the cake do? The things undid in the land of undone call to us in the flames. What I didn't do took an eternity, and it wasn't for lack of trying. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. This has been just a wonderful, wonderful sort of feast of ideas and poetry. And it's great to see you again.
It's great to see you.
Yes, all of the poems will be in the packet that we will send out to all the registrants. And if for some reason you're not on the list, you can share your email and we'll get it to you as well.
Okay, and our next workshop will be next month. That's Rosalie and Mary Anna doing a workshop that has to do with flowers, photography, and poetry. And Rosalie and Mary Anna, what's the date of that?
That is June 6th and June 13th.
Okay, exciting. You want to say just a little bit about what you'll be doing? You're muted, Mariana.
It's basically
Darn.
We've lost you again, Mariana. Rosalie, can you pick up the thread if Mariana's lost her sound? And while she's doing that again, June 6th and 13th, Rosalie and Mariana will speak on the language of flowers.
Oh, we're going to do some haiku, to do some haven, work with how you would combine and looking at the flowers, like using the language of flowers, and then combining some of the poems and maybe working with photography as well, like putting your poems with a photograph.
Mm.
I don't have the whole explanation right here, but it's kind of different, so it'll be nice.
They are both wonderful photographers as well as poets, so I look forward to that aspect.
So thank you most of all to Lee. Thank you so much. It's just been really a great pleasure. Thank you to Cheryl. Thank you to the Lansing Poetry Club and the awesome and intrepid board of directors who managed to get everything done. So goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. Stay well.
Stay
Thank
well.
you. Thank you.
Um, so if you like, Ruelaine, I can add to our handout the poems that we wanted to add.
So that was the apology and
Yeah, we definitely want the apology because Lee read it. Do we want Diserotica or shall we skip that?
sure, I think the more the merrier.
Okay.
Have that one too?
Okay, so I will add also the prompt for that.
Okay, great.
Right. Um,
Anything else that we should think about before we close up?
People who are still here, Francis, was there something that you wanted to ask? I think that maybe the other people have momentarily stepped away.
Possibly, yeah. Fran, you're muted.
You're muted, Fran.